Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our event, which will explore how to spread the gains from trade more evenly. We're broadcasting our event to a global audience on World Bank Live. If you'd like to participate in the discussion, please use the chat function on the right side of your screen. We have an expert live blogger, Jacob Engel, to answer your questions. And during the discussion, we'll also try to pose as many of the questions from the audience as we can to our panelists. Today, we're extremely pleased to launch a new publication, The Distributional Impacts of Trade. We'll hear a presentation from the report authors in a few moments. We have posted a link to the full report in the chat. But before we begin the presentation, I'd like to introduce Mari Pangestu, the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, to say some opening remarks. She's exceptionally well placed to discuss these topics, having served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade from 2004 to 2011, and as Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy from 2011 to 2014. Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Good day to everyone. I'm really delighted to open this launch of the World Bank's latest report. And I'm very pleased that we will be hearing later from His Excellency Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez, Secretary of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico, and His Excellency Ferraz, Secretary of Foreign Trade of Brazil, alongside other distinguished experts. Prudence Sebahizi from the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, and of course, my old friend, Alan Winters from University of Sussex. It's good to see you, Alan. I always associate Alan as giving the topic of trade and poverty prominence, and I'm sure he will be glad to know that this body of work that he started when he was at the bank continues to thrive with our latest report on the distributional impacts of trade. This report examines the important links between global trade and poverty reduction. And I would hope really advances our understanding of how shifting movements of trade can affect the poor. And most importantly, how policymakers can ensure that trade gains are more widely shared. As Minister of Trade, I often said that I was the Minister of Trade and Development, because trade is a means to development, job creation, poverty reduction. And I always also emphasize that it's not just up to trade policy, that we needed complementary policies to ensure that trade led to the desired development and distribution outcomes. And the evidence that's been built up over many years shows that there's no question about the strong relationship between trade growth and poverty reduction. From 1990 to 2017, developing countries increased their share of global exports from 16 to 30%. And at the same time, extreme poverty plunged from 36 to 9%. In my own country, Indonesia, trade was an engine of growth. It created jobs, reduced poverty, and the trade and investment reforms that we undertook, as well as the regional economic integration that has been happening in the region for the last 2-3 decades, did attract better investments and catalyze trade. But as all policymakers will appreciate, highlighting the advantage of trade and its contribution to poverty reduction wasn't enough. For every tariff that was lifted or new regulation that we introduced that spurred competition, there was always the potential business owner or workers whose livelihood was at risk, and their voices tend to be very, very, very loud. Therefore, this work is vital at a time when we see the rise in anti-globalization and protectionism trends, as the benefits are perceived to be not equally shared, and at a time when we actually need support for trade openness. During the pandemic, we were reminded of the essential role of trade to ensure flows of food, medical supplies, and enabling global vaccine production and distribution. So trade will also play a critical role in economic recovery, creating jobs and reducing poverty in the post-pandemic period. So policymakers recognize that we need to still support the trade agenda, but they also recognize that the distributional impacts of trade have been uneven and unequal. So, and we also observed that the gains and losses of trade have been heavily concentrated in certain sectors, certain jobs, and certain regions. Therefore, to get support for trade, we need to equip policymakers with the evidence-based narrative of how trade can also reduce global disparities by putting policies in place to spread gains more widely. There is, fortunately, literature growing in the economics field that show that losses from trade may be deeper, more concentrated, and longer lasting than previously understood. But it has been primarily focused on advanced economies. That's why I'm delighted that this World Bank report enhances our understanding of the distributional impacts of trade in developing countries, using new innovative data and tools to understand the impacts of trade on welfare at a more granular level. I'm hoping that this evidence base will help policymakers design effective and well-targeted policies to maximize the benefits of trade, minimize adjustment costs, and spread the gains more widely. As you know, it looks at 5 countries: Bangladesh, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. And in line with our green, resilient, and inclusive development approach, this report highlights ways to maximize the gains from trade and support lasting and inclusive economic growth. And importantly, I think this analysis shows that countries should continue seeking trade as a pathway to development and how to make trade work for everyone. That is really the key for policymakers and politicians. With that, I will hand back to Caroline to introduce the report's authors and presentation.
Thank you very much, Mari, for setting the stage. The report, I should say, is a product, a joint work between our trade and poverty teams. And we have one of the trade authors, Marila Mariszewska, senior economist working on trade, and an author from poverty, Gladys Lopez Acevedo, a lead economist, to present the report.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to tell you why did we decide to write the report on the distributional impacts of trade. Why is it important? Firstly, this report makes the benefits of trade in developing countries more visible. Most of what we know comes from the studies on developed countries, and this report helps to redress the imbalance. Secondly, this report serves as a reminder that trade and poverty go hand in hand. As already Mari has mentioned, the rise of international trade has transformed the global economy and coincided with a dramatic reduction in global poverty. Third, this report addresses the reality of trade. The benefits are shared by many, while the adjustment costs tend to be concentrated and affect certain regions, industries, and workers. Now, what do we mean by adjustment costs? The evidence is clear. Trade liberalization is beneficial to economies and societies overall. However, we know that some groups of workers tend to face temporary unemployment or loss of incomes when their jobs are lost and they need to relocate to more competitive, productive sectors. This is the adjustment cost that we have in mind. Multiple studies have shown that trade liberalization benefits outweigh these adjustment costs. However, more can be done to minimize them and to make trade more inclusive. Fourth, this report provides policymakers with knowledge, data, and tools to understand the distributional impacts of trade. It outlines the policies that can leverage trade to reduce extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity while minimizing the adjustment costs. And finally, this report is a response to protectionism. While overall trade is seen positively in many parts of the world, protectionism and economic nationalism are on the rise. Why are we focusing on trade and distributional impacts right now? This report comes at a critical time for trade. Trade is more important than ever due to its vital role in production and provision of food, medicines, and vaccines, and it will remain essential to the economic recovery. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the incomes of the poor and women disproportionately hard, making the case for understanding and addressing the distributional impacts of trade even stronger. What is the value added of this work? Well, first, the report provides new findings on impacts of trade in developing countries. It provides new data and tools for measuring the distributional impacts of trade based on empirical studies and scenario analysis. Third, it provides lessons for policymakers on how to maximize the benefits from trade and how to make sure that trade becomes more inclusive. Finally, it provides ways to strengthen distributional focus in World Bank operations. So what are the aspects of the distributional impacts that we focus on in this report? Well, we look across a variety of dimensions. We applied a wide range of tools to study the distributional impacts of trade across time and space. We studied the impacts of a wide range of policy reforms, and we looked at the national and at the subnational level. And we employ 5 country case studies from 3 continents, and we focus on a variety of outcomes. We look at wages and consumption, formal, informal employment, poverty and inequality by gender, and educational attainment. What about the data? Well, we needed to generate a new data set to study the impacts of distributional, impacts of trade at the subnational level. We did it by extending the gender disaggregated labor data set to provide subnational data on wages and employment by skill and gender for 70 developing countries. By doing so, we learned, for example, that in Ethiopia, the urban gender pay gap seems to be the highest in the west of the country, while tradable sectors are characterized by relatively low gender wage gap. But it's really in the Sri Lanka case study where we fully illustrate the usefulness of the data set and the new tools for policymakers. What we do there is we do a forward-looking analysis of a wide range of trade policy reforms and study their impacts on employment at the subnational level. What we find is that overall gains for growth and poverty reduction are substantial, but they tend to be concentrated in certain urban areas, potentially exacerbating the existing spatial inequalities. To sum up, this report provides knowledge, data, and tools to inform policymakers on how to spread the gains from trade more widely to make trade work for the poor. I'll now turn it over to Gladys to discuss the case studies and policy recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marilla. So I will talk about what are the new insights and findings from the case study. I think it's important to remind that the report provides a more balanced picture of the benefits and adjustment costs of trade in developing countries. This is since the focus of the literature so far has been on developed countries, highlighting the negative impact of trade on workers' employment due to greater import competition. The report sheds new light on the type of adjustment costs, channels through which trade impacts welfare, and the speed at which this happens. There it derives important policy lessons. For example, the need for more integration across geographic regions and across sectors. In the case of Brazil, a 10% increase in exports led to a 2.3% increase in employment and a 3.1% increase in average wages. The manufacturing sector attracted workers from other industries within the same micro regions, but workers from other regions could not move because large moving costs. In the case of Mexico, municipalities more exposed to trade experienced an increase in labor force participation, labor income, and attracted more net migration, particularly of unskilled workers. However, these positive effects tend to be concentrated in the tradable sector, with little integration to non-tradable. Another important lesson or finding from our report is that policy is needed to encourage opportunity and mobility. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, localities more exposed to trade experience an increase in wages and a reduction of informality. These positive effects spread through the economy over time and benefited other sectors as well. However, in the case of South Africa, local labor market effects of trade were stronger in municipalities that included former homelands, and they received the blunt of the negative effect. Former homelands had little economic activity beyond subsistence agriculture, so workers had few economic alternatives to move to other sectors. The high mobility costs prevented them from seeking jobs in other regions. Another important finding from the report is that there is a strong connection between trade and formalization. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, the export surge in apparel led to a reduction of informality, which was higher for women compared to men. A $100 gain in exports per worker led to a 0.7% decrease in informality in districts with a higher exposure to trade. In the case of Brazil, informality acted as a buffer in the event of a negative trade shock that otherwise would have thrown people into unemployment. As Marilla said, an important value added of the report are the tools that are provided there. And these tools have been extremely useful to assess the impact of trade policy on welfare. As Marilla mentioned, in the case of Sri Lanka, we had the opportunity to test the tools that were developed in the program or in the report. And the simulation showed that the potential effect of trade liberalization on consumption could be positive through lower food prices. However, this positive effect could be outweighed by the income gains benefiting the well-off in urban areas the most. So how can all these insights be useful for implementation? Well, first, by identifying in advance sectors and regions that could be most affected by changes in trade patterns, policies and the tools provided in this report can be designed to maximize the gains and mitigate adjustment costs. The report contributes to this goal twofold. First, providing tools, data, and approaches to design smarter policies for inclusive trade. And second, by providing a framework that could guide policymakers both for planning, implementation, and mitigation anchored in three areas: reduce distortion, reduce trade costs, and speed up labor market adjustment. The report also goes further and derives recommendations both at the national and the multilateral level. In terms of the national level, what is needed for the design of inclusive trade policies. We provide several examples there. It is important first to take a whole economy lens to trade reforms, announce reforms early and in a transparent way, engage with the private sector. What are the recommendations at the multilateral level? Remove barriers and distortions that could hamper competition, work on labor standards, and promote business conduct. What is the World Bank doing in applying this distributional lens? As Marilla said, we have been working together for the last 2 years, and we have now a portal featuring the report, the background papers that are part of this work, and the tools that have been developed. Also, we have work on knowledge exchanges showcasing current analytical and operational work in this area and providing technical assistance in projects and operations. To sum up, the goal is to maximize the benefits of trade for the poor and minimize adjustment costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marilla and Gladys, for this quick overview of the main messages and highlights of the report. I think you really whetted everybody's appetite, and I'm sure after the event, many of us will go and read the full report. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Carolina Sánchez, and I am the Global Director for Poverty and Equity here at the World Bank. And it is a real pleasure to chair this panel discussion on the findings of the report, but more broadly on the distributional impacts of trade. Let me start by introducing our very distinguished panelists, and I will do so using only their current job titles, but I do invite you to look at their full bios, which are shared in the event page, because we truly have a powerhouse here today in terms of their knowledge and experience of the topic at hand. So it's a pleasure to have with us Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez, who's the Minister of Finance in Mexico. Welcome, Arturo. Lucas Ferraz, who's the Secretary of Foreign Trade in Brazil. Welcome, Lucas. Prudence Sebahitsi, who's the Chief Technical Advisor for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Welcome. Alan Winters, who's a professor of economics at the University of Sussex in the UK. Welcome, Alan. And of course, Mari Pangestu, who's the managing director at the World Bank and who we already heard from at the very beginning of this event. Before we get started, just a quick reminders. Caroline mentioned this, but I want to repeat it in case somebody joined us a few minutes late. We will be taking questions from the audience. If you have questions, please submit them through the World Bank Group Live webpage chat that's on the right of your screen. We'll be monitoring that throughout the conversation, and we'll pose some of the questions to our panelists. Because we suspect we'll have many more questions that we actually managed to cover in the hour that we have together. We also have expert bloggers that will be responding to your questions in real time. So please do take advantage of that. So without further ado, let me kick off the discussion and dive right in. And maybe I'll start with Minister Herrera and ask you about some of the Mexican experience. We know that the NAFTA trade agreement helped to diversify Mexico's export basket, and the report makes the point that it also had positive impacts on total incomes in Mexico. But the report also suggests that there's still room to translate some of these gains into further poverty reduction, so that we are not only talking about average gains, but really distributional gains at the local level. So given that, what are, in your view, some of the policy actions that are needed to make the gains from trade, and particularly from NAFTA, even more inclusive than they have been to date? Over to you.
That's actually a very relevant question, but there's another way to put it, which is if we should be so surprised that the benefits of NAFTA has been distributed unevenly in Mexico. And the reason I say so is because the country is extremely heterogeneous. If one thinks in a very, very old and very, very basic growth theory hypothesis, the catch-up hypothesis, it states that supposedly low-income economies grow faster than more advanced economies, so there should be a catch-up. And in principle, that could also be applied regionally within a country. But the fact is that has not worked in Mexico, and the differences are extremely striking. So let me just give you a couple of numbers. The GDP per capita of Mexico City is 7 times the GDP per capita of Chiapas. So let me give you another number which is related to trade. Trade in Mexico is mostly concentrated in the northern part of the country, the closest to the US. If we look to the Human Development Index, if we look at the municipality of Mitontic in Chiapas, they have a Human Development Index which is basically equivalent to the Human Development Index of Gambia. Then, if we look to the Human Development Index of San Pedro Garza Garcia, an industrial city in the northern part of Mexico, that's slightly above than the Human Development Index of Israel. So presume that there should be an immediate and almost automatic convergence between these low-income municipalities in Mexico is basically like assuming that there should be some automatic convergence between Gambia and Israel, or Gambia and the UK, which has a Human Development Index of Miguel Hidalgo. Now, what has happened since the free trade agreement, and the first free trade agreement was signed in 1994, is that not only we don't have a catch-up, but we have a divergence in the country. The richest state has become richer, and the poorest state are growing smaller. So again, in this classical growth theory, what we are not seeing is kind of a same system, but basically 2 equilibria. One equilibria for some states and some equilibria for the rest. And the question is, why is this so different? And the point I'm trying to make is basically if we just create a conditions, let me put it in this way, market conditions that facilitate trade, that's not enough, right? So what Gladys and Marianne, yes, were mentioned, and Mariela were mentioned before, it was trying to make sure that there are no barriers and there are no distortions. But basically, Mexico has signed between 50 to 52 free trade agreements across the globe with some of the largest partners, with the exception of China. It's probably coverage something close to 75, 80% of GDP. So there's no more distortion, but that's not sufficient, right? So that clearly has not been sufficient. So the question is, what is different? And what is different is that the production means, if you want it, in the South are completely different. Infrastructure is different, education, human capital is different, etc. So it requires not only a change in terms of the legal and trade framework, but it requires a change in terms of the capacity of production of the states. So one thing, we're doing a few things that's probably relevant to that. One is we are increasing the investment in infrastructure in the southern part. So for a state in the, let's say, in the industrial belt in the middle of Mexico, let's say Querétaro or Guanajuato, it probably takes just 9 to 10 hours to take something all over to Texas. But if you consider to Chiapas, it's much more larger to do that. So we need to invest in ports, etc., just to try to level the field between poorer states and relatively richer states. The second part, which is related to the human capital, is what we have realized is that we have a mismatch of skills in the country. So there may be demand for certain kind of jobs, and there are people who are willing to get a job in those sectors, just they don't happen to have the skills. And there's some sort of fixed cost associated of them getting the skills. So what we have been trying, and we were really invested in that before COVID, so we haven't seen, we are in no condition to evaluate the results because COVID really put an impasse to some extent that program. We create a program which is very similar to the trainees programs that existed in Europe, in which we paid for several months of in-job training for workers, with the idea that they will acquire those job-specific skills, and then eventually they could get into the formal market. But our whole idea behind this is that there were a lack of infrastructure or capital, human capital, etc., and just a framework, a trade framework, a pure trade framework, were not sufficient to do that. Now, Gladys mentioned constraints to mobility, and that may be right to some extent, because if one looks, let's say, many of people working in the maquilas in the northern part, there may be people who migrate from the southern part of Mexico to the northern part of those states. And that may solve part of the problem, the fact that they, as individuals, are able to get better opportunities in a different job. That doesn't solve the problem that the southern states are still poor. Actually, they may be poorer when you have this kind of mobility, because the relatively highly skilled workers move to another state. So it's really the bet on our side, and it's a bet because we are doing it, but we will have to see how has impact, is to take large infrastructure projects to the southern part and have this in the job training skills. Now, the infrastructure part is extremely important for two things. One, it creates jobs there while you are getting involved in the actual building. And second, in principle, it should create jobs after they start working. And we have quite an interesting, I would say, it's an almost natural experiment during the pandemic that it really put together these two ideas. As every country, we were heavily hit by the pandemic. We lost close to 12 million, 11 to 12 million jobs in the country. A little bit more than one was in the formal sector. 11 were basically in the informal sector, right? And it is not until you basically tame the pandemic that you will get back to sort of normal conditions. But for the last probably 6 months, there are 3 states that basically recover all the jobs lost on the pandemic and have add on that. So they basically have a health crisis, but those states don't have an economic crisis. They actually in sort of a very specific boom. So which are those 3 states? One is Baja California, which is a border state. So it's basically being dragged by the activity in the US. The other one is Chihuahua, which is a border state with Texas. And again, is basically dragged by the economic activity in the US. So that also gives you an idea of how the recovery is also going to be different, with those states which are much more involved in trade activities recovering faster than the rest of the country. And that probably we would have expected. The third state was what was really a surprise, and that's Tabasco. That's in the center of the country, it's in the Gulf, and it's basically explained by one large infrastructure project in a refinery. So this gives you an idea how in parts of the country which are not really heavily involved at this moment in trade, infrastructure is important, and that also will prepare them for a potential further engagement in trade activities along the country. Let me stop here, Carolina.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect way of kicking off this discussion. And I think this point that you made about, how pre-existing inequalities in infrastructure, in human capital, in productive structure really shape, how the gains of trade are distributed. And that's really where policy has a role to play. And I also very much enjoy your point of, policies for people, policies for places. And I know that that's something that the report does get into a little bit. Let's continue to explore some country experiences. And I'm going to turn now to Secretary Ferraz and explore a bit the sort of the Brazil experience. The research in this report shows that the adjustment cost associated with the trade liberalization in Brazil in the 1990s were both large and long-lasting. So what steps has the country taken since then to support workers that were negatively impacted by some of these reforms, by the shocks that the trade liberalization process generated? And what additional policies are needed if this is still an unfinished agenda? Over to you.
So thank you. Good morning, everybody, again. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to start congratulating the World Bank for this very important initiative, especially in the case of the developing economies, as already highlighted by the previous speakers, and also in the case of Brazil, which is nowadays implementing gradually a process of trade liberalization in our country. I would like to start also highlighting, as previous speakers did, the gains, the relevance of trade openness, the gains from trade, the relevance of trade liberalization to productivity growth, to fight poverty, and also to increase the number of jobs and also and mainly the quality of jobs. Before exactly delving deeper on the question that was made, I would like just to highlight some stylized facts that will perhaps corroborate what previous speakers have already said. And also, I think my intervention here is quite in line with my colleague from Mexico, because I think the study from Dixie Carneiro and Kovac, which is basically the main issue here, the results, they did not come really as a big surprise, in the sense of pointing out winners and losers from trade liberalization in the 90s. Perhaps the main novelty, behind this study is the duration of these disparities, and mainly the fact that the disparities between the relative gains of income and formal jobs, these disparities, they increase through time. They did not diminish through time as expected. If you think in simple models where we consider free labor and free capital mobility, which is of course not the real, thing. So for the stylized effects, as I said, if you take, for instance, the relationship between unemployment rates and import penetration, in all the countries in the world, if you build a graphic and try to see any kind of correlation between those two variables, the answer is quite simple. There is no correlation. There is no apparent correlation between import penetration, measured as total imports over GDP, and unemployment rates. Yeah. Another important stylized fact that I would like to mention is the fact that probably, and I'm not downplaying the importance of trade policy as a factor that may impact income inequality and unemployment, but probably and most likely, trade policy is not the main factor behind, those issues. And I will give just a very simple example. I will take the European Union. If you take the European Union, you have over 27 economies now, without the United Kingdom, but you have 27 economies. They follow the same trade policy, exactly the same trade policy, but they have completely different unemployment rates. Just take the Czech Republic, you have 3% unemployment rate. Just take Greece, you have, of course, again, I'm not downplaying the relevance of those studies, of the study of the World Bank, but I'm just emphasizing, highlighting the fact that trade policy is not really, the main culprit behind unemployment and maybe even income inequality. If you take the recent studies involving the American economy, the United States, we have seen a very strong increase in income inequality in the United States since the 70s. And most of the recent studies that we have nowadays, they suggest that trade policy, including China, doesn't explain this huge increase in income inequality in the United States. And probably the most important cause of this strong increase in income inequality in the United States is not trade, is technological progress. Yeah. So I'm just saying this, again, not to downplay the importance, of the topic today of our discussion, but it's important not to lose the perspective of the things that we are talking about. Okay. And it's especially, I'm emphasizing this because nowadays we are exactly, supporting the idea of having a more open and integrated to the global economy country here in Brazil. We are, intensifying our agenda of trade agreements, the common external tariff in Mercosur. We are having a big discussion in terms of its reform, the reduction of its average, which is quite high nowadays. And we are fully sure that is something important for Brazil, especially in our case, where we have an economy with a stagnant productivity for more than 30 years, and one of the most closed economies in the world. And regarding exactly the study of Dixie, Carneiro, and Kovac, which I think is the basis of the question that was made by Mrs. Caroline. I would like to stress, of course, the study is very important. It highlights, a very important point in terms of winners and losers in the case of the trade liberalization in the 90s, which is completely different of the trade liberalization that we have been conducting now. And I will say a few words on this more in the end of my intervention. But I would like to say that the study basically come up with relative comparisons. Yeah. So they're saying, oh, hey, the municipalities that were more heavily hit by trade liberalization, they grew relatively less in terms of income, and they grew relatively less in terms of formal jobs. But they say nothing about, you know, the winners of trade. For instance, the expanding exporting sectors, you know, that probably gain a lot with the tariff reductions that we carried out in the 90s. They don't say a word in terms of, and perhaps most importantly, in terms of net welfare. It's very important to say this. They say nothing about net welfare, you know, and they say nothing about productivity. And we have, you know, by the way, lots of good and studies, well-published studies, suggesting that the net welfare effects in the case of trade liberalization in Brazil in the 90s were really positive and significant. Also, several studies suggesting, you know, significant gains in terms of productivity, again, as a result of trade liberalization in the 90s. So it's not to downplay the importance of the study, but again, we need to put things in perspective and see how we can manage the problems in the most appropriate way. Also, I would like to say that the trade liberalization that we had in the 90s was conducted in a very short period of time, and the tariff cuts were really huge. This is completely different, you know, from the trade liberalization that we have been conducting now in at least two dimensions. We have been conducting a trade liberalization process in a very gradual way, very gradual, with predictability and with and most importantly, in parallel with several important supply side reforms in our domestic economy. And when I say supply side reforms, of course, I'm touching upon the issue of factor mobility, labor mobility, capital mobility, just to mention a few. For instance, we have approved our pension reform. We have approved our labor reform in 2017, which will come up with new modalities, new flexible modalities of jobs that has decreased litigation a lot, and also that has reduced the costs of hiring and layoffs in our country, and that will bring, for sure, a higher labor demand, and will help adjustment process related to trade liberalization. We also have in Brazil reforms devoted to improve the business environment in the country, like the new regulatory framework for gas, natural gas, and sanitation services in the country. We have approved central bank independency. We have a new law on, we have a new bankruptcy law in the country. So several reforms that will, for sure, improve the quality of the business environment in the country, and of course will affect labor and capital mobility, which is, of course, vital, you know, to guarantee, to maximize the gains from trade. What else? Also, I would like to highlight the initiatives specifically devoted to labor market and capital mobility, because the reforms that I mentioned previously, they were, I mean, reforms devoted to reduce the so-called Brazilian cost, to improve the business environment, but are not specifically focused on factor mobility. So I would like to mention in this regard that Brazil, as a developing economy, of course, we are not the United States. We don't have a TAA here in Brazil, which is a program specifically focused on people that became unemployed because of trade liberalization. And frankly speaking, I don't see any reason why we should care more about unemployed people from trade liberalization than unemployed people from any other reason. Unemployed people are unemployed people. We should help them. So most of the initiatives that we have been undertaking over the last years in Brazil regarding factor mobility are horizontal by nature. So first of all, we have now new programs devoted to qualification. So most of the policies that we have been implementing in Brazil, we try, and we pay a special attention to this. We try to undertake reforms that have evidence, that are evidence-based. So regarding the studies, the evidence that we have regarding the effectiveness of those programs in terms of labor qualification, requalification, and to reduce the costs, the adjustment costs of labor mobility, what we have is the following. Monetary compensation is clearly ineffective. What seems to work, and the evidence is not so clear, but what seems to work is requalification, capacitation, and training. But we are going perhaps a step further on this. We have programs in Brazil like Pronatec, and recently the newly created program Emprega Mais, that are focused on requalification, training, capacitation, but this is crucial. They are focused on the labor demand needs. So all those programs, they are conducted in the partnership with the private sector. We need to understand exactly what are the needs from the private sector before trying, to set up training programs and requalification programs. And this is exactly what we have been doing at the moment in Brazil with those programs, Pronatec and Emprega Mais. And
Secretary Ferraz, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think we'll be able to get into a lot of the specifics later in the discussion. So maybe if you can sort of, complete your overview, and then we can come back to this, because, the details, you're right. In the end, the devil is in the details, right? And how we do these things, but we'll come back to some of these later.
Yeah. And just to finalize, I would mention, just to conclude my preliminary comments, to mention the tax reform that we have been discussing in Brazil, that will also help in terms of capital mobility, which is of course important. We have a big fiscal war in Brazil in terms of subsidies and whatever, and this reform will address all those issues, and I think it will also for the benefit of capital mobility in the country. Thanks a lot, and I'm sorry for the long intervention.
No, thank you. And, as I said, I think this is exactly what we want to get, right? Is the nuances and the details. And thank you also, I think, for reminding us of two very important points that I think the report authors also put forward. The first one is that the net gains from trade are positive, right? In terms of growth and income. And I think that that's something that is highlighted in the report, but maybe we didn't highlight it sufficiently, in our introductory remarks. And then the second is that, the real world is not an economic model, and that there are lots of frictions in labor and other markets. And that's why when we think about the benefits of trade policy is only one instrument, but we really need to think about a variety of other complementary policies and take a whole of government approach. So I think your examples really illustrated that very clearly. So thanks for that. Let me turn now to Mr. Sebahitsi and ask, change geographies and ask a little bit about the Africa outlook and what's happening there. And we know that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement will create the largest free trade area in the world as measured by the number of countries, in the agreement. The pact would connect 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined gross domestic product that is valued at about $3.4 trillion. So we are really talking, big orders of magnitude here. In addition, the agreement could have the potential to lift 30 million people out of poverty in a continent where poverty is still a problem. So in that context, what are some of the actions that African policymakers can take to ensure that the gains from the agreement will be shared, both across countries and within countries? And I also want to tag on a question that I think is relevant in this context that we heard from Susan on the chat that said, to what extent the agreement has the potential to accelerate a structural transformation in African countries. And I think that's also very linked to this idea of gains, who will gain, and the impacts on poverty. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for that introduction, as well as the question that you have asked. Let me start by congratulating World Bank, of course, for bringing us together around this well-researched topic on the distributional impact of trade. Let me also bring to you the greetings of His Excellency Wamukele Mene, the Secretary General of African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. He would have wished to be here with us, but due to area commitments, he requested me to represent him at this high-level panel. So having said that, I would add to your question that AfCFTA is expected not only to contribute to poverty reduction on the continent, but also to bridging the income gaps among a variety of different segments of the population on the continent. And we are looking at this in a positive way because we've not had this free trade area bringing together 55 countries before. It's the first time. And we are looking at it in a positive way to make sure that policies that will be put in place by individual countries will make AfCFTA work. This is very important. Why? Because when you look at Africa as a continent, 55 countries, 107 borders, and those borders are land borders, because when you look at Africa as a continent, it's like an island. You look at the rate of protection in Africa. When you do business in Africa, you have to pay on average 6.9% of tariff if your products have to cross the border. So the AfCFTA is aimed at easing the flow of goods and services across African countries, removing all those artificial borders and creating one integrated market. But the implementation of this agreement will require serious actions by policymakers if we have really to ensure that it contributes to the outcomes that are expected. And those policies will have to vary from one country to the other. It's not a kind of uniform policy for all African countries. They have to be specific. And some of the general policies that we think will contribute to the success of AfCFTA, which can also be aligned into national contexts, will be, first of all, to put in place adequate structures and systems. Of course, where there are none, countries have to look at the structures and ensure that their structures and systems are adequate. They have to ensure that they create awareness among all the stakeholders to ensure everyone is involved in this entire process, but also develop specific strategies that will guide the maximization of benefits and ensure equitable distribution of those benefits. So coming back to your question, one of the specific actions that I think policymakers have to consider is to increase awareness around the AfCFTA for all national stakeholders. And this will assist to maximize inclusive trade opportunities. And the participation of key segments of African population, here we are talking about women, youth, and of course, people with disabilities, is the prerequisite for successful and inclusive AFCFTA. And the participation of these groups in trade is often not taken care of or not considered carefully when trade agreements are negotiated and implemented, because you know trade agreements are mainly negotiated by governments. So it's the role of governments to involve those other stakeholders in the implementation, but also in the negotiation process. The second action, which I think is very important, is to build strong institutions and regulatory frameworks that will support effective implementation of the agreement. We are in the process of assisting member states, African countries, to develop their national implementation strategies for AFCFTA. And those national strategies should analyze the policies, the legal foundation, regulations that govern the current production systems, as well as their trade composition and trade pattern of each and every country. Look at the structures, the financial investment constraints that trade performance is suffering from. Look at economic competitiveness of the country, and look at all those factors that will contribute to the success of the FCFTA, without forgetting technology. Technology is very important. It's another factor that has to be taken into consideration. The third action will be to enhance production and productive capacity. Now, the FCFTA creates a market, but this market is meant for African products. Currently, Africa is trading at around 80%. So which means that the remainder, 2%, is trade between Africa and the rest of the world. So if the market is now created, borders or restrictions are removed, it means that each country has to go back and look into their national policies on how to develop their productive capacities. And the different market opportunities and industries, regional value chains development, competitiveness measures have to be put in place, support the integration of micro, small, and medium enterprises into those regional and continental value chains through production linkages and awareness creation. The fourth action, which I also think can be taken by policymakers, is to facilitate the reduction of trade cost or trade transaction costs. And this can be done. Of course, we have a legal instrument like trade facilitation annex to the protocol. We have annex on non-tariff barriers elimination. So this can be done by making sure that non-tariff barriers are addressed, that trade facilitation measures are put in place, that trade is facilitated as much as possible, because we know all these non-tariff barriers are embedded in the policies and the procedures that are put in place by governments. The other important consideration, apart from those specific actions that I have just mentioned, is that each country has to look at the private sector capacity, because at the end, if you do not have a strong private sector, then it's going to be very difficult for you to compete with other countries. It's going to be difficult to maximize opportunities of the FCFTA market. So countries have to look at the capacities of their private sector, look at the structures of their industries, look at all the sectors that will contribute to the production, and ensure that they produce competitively, because the FCFTA market is not giving a favor to one country, it's just leveling the playground for all players on the continent. So I believe that the FCFTA implementation, as I mentioned, should be guided by those strategies. And those strategies should make clear recommendations on how best to improve the implementation of FCFTA in each and every African countries with a view to promoting trade performance, competitiveness, digitalization, investment, and industrialization. I think those are the key actions that I have in mind can assist implementation of the FCFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, we keep hearing this point on, you know, the complementary policies, which I think is critical. But I think you also brought two other issues, new issues into the discussion. First is that even though we all understand that the gains from trade are positive, ultimately trade policy is complex and it's a difficult and sort of messy process. First, because, you know, trade is not just tariffs, right? There are lots of other non-tariff elements to effective trade. And also, as you said, because no one size fits all. So when we engage in trade negotiations, you know, nations need to sort of strike the right balance between developing a shared vision and an objective, but also attending to country specific needs. And you know, again, I can see how that can, you know, generate some tension. And I also want to echo the point that you made on impacts. And I think for, you know, for the first part of the discussion, when we talked about distributional impacts, we've really focused on sort of income dimensions, right? The poor, the vulnerable, and other groups. But you reminded us that there are other types of distributional impacts associated with trade, you know, gender impacts, the impacts on youth, the impacts on other vulnerable groups that are also important and that, you know, should be a part of this discussion. So thank you for that. We are going to sort of take a step back and maybe now move away from a specific geography and sort of look at this issue from sort of a higher level. And I'm going to turn to Professor Winters to help us do this and ask the following question. You know, the gains from an open sort of rules-based international trading system, I think are evident sort of in our day-to-day life for those of us that are paying attention, although they are not always well understood, certainly by those that are not experts. So what do you see as sort of the main challenges to the multilateral trade system and to continue globalization? And I think Gladys and Marila sort of alluded to, you know, this renewed sort of wave of potential protectionism that we've seen emerging in recent years. So how would that play out? And in relation to that, you know, how is trade impacting different types of workers across and within countries? You know, we've heard about the specific experiences of some countries and areas of the world, but you have that sort of global perspective. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you to the bank for doing this report. I mean, it's a subject very close to my heart, I must say. So let me take the second part of your question first, because in truth it's so difficult I can't really answer it. What we've really heard from other speakers, but what you get even more strongly from the report is it's different. This is a very, very heterogeneous issue. And therefore, we've got to be really careful about sort of trying to infer generalities from just sort of a few examples. I do think that we've learned from trade, but also from other areas, not least COVID, that the poor and the disadvantages tend to be able to react to changes, be they external shocks, COVID, or policy changes, trade liberalization, less strongly. They have less ability to cope, less ability to take advantage of new opportunities. And that, it seems to me, is one of the big issues about inequality in general, that a group who are left behind actually have to work harder to keep up. But it's also a really strong direction to us so far as policy is concerned. Not just for trade, but for all sorts of reasons, we need to be thinking about sort of social support. I don't mean in a very narrow way social workers and so on, but just how do societies work that in fact bring opportunities to everyone. Opening up trade is an opportunity. Comes with some shocks, comes with some forces, but actually it's an opportunity. And therefore you want to try and make sure that it's not just the oligarchs, it's not just the people who've been educated in Western universities who can take advantage, but it actually is for other people. That's rather trite. How do you do that? Well, that depends, a lot on your individual circumstances. And I mean, I've got a bit more to say about that if you like. Let me go back to the first part of the question. Oh dear, I mean, I don't think any of us is unaware that the trading system is under a good deal of pressure, and that multilateralism has rather fallen out of favour. Now, why is that? There are a variety of reasons, but actually I suspect that deep down the problem is trade has just become terribly, terribly ordinary. We just got to taking it for granted. No one feels it's very interesting these days to say in debates, no, one of the really key things about policy is that you have to have competition and openness to the rest of the world is very different. Now, there's always going to be shocks from the system, and there are always going to be losers from any trade policy. Trade policy is inherently distributional. It really is about taking away artificial advantages for one group to create advantages for another. You can't get away from that. As the report commented, I think the authors earlier, the benefits are rather diffuse, very broad. The losses are very focused. People who are in that small set of losers are really motivated to argue. I suspect we have dismissed them too much, the sort of hubris of the 1990s about we've won the Cold War, the market has succeeded, just get over it, it will all be all right in the end. Frankly, I think that was overdone, and I take some responsibility for that myself. My former employers, the World Bank, also need to take some responsibility. It's really important that we listen, we actually hear that. But it's slightly more complex at the moment, because what we've moved to in the last 4 or 5 years is a new sort of politics. It's very populist, very interventionist. We're seeing it in lots and lots of countries where previously we didn't. So there's no longer a sort of steady view that actually, there'll be little wrinkles and little things we have to do around the edges, but keeping the trading system open is a very important principle. Actually, what we've got is a series of people whose politics is more nationalistic than multilateral, who get political kudos from acting, concrete actions, I'm saving you, from this principle that is espoused by experts and the elites. And so essentially what we've got is a big tilt in the political process. I mean, I say to Mari, they don't make politicians like they used to. And I suspect that is we just got used to trade. It's always there. I live in Britain. I've been through the Brexit debate. People just don't sort of get the idea that trade really matters. So essentially what we've got is a trading system that's sort of friendless and is dying not from one massive violation, but a death from 1,000 cuts. A steel tariff here, a little restriction on professional qualifications there, a vaccine export ban here. And so it goes on, and gradually the sort of magic that we're all in this together, it matters as a system, the payoff is going to come in the long run, sort of disappears. Frankly, until we get some sort of change in heart, it's very difficult to see what we're going to do other than essentially sort of put our fingers in the dike. Sort of serious repair work is going to be quite hard. I mean, I think many of us hoped that Brexit was going to prove to the world that actually throwing sand into the wheels of your international trade was a less than brilliant idea, and that this would be a wonderful, wonderful natural experiment for people who ought to test whether trade really matters. Unfortunately, with COVID, it's all getting very cloudy, and we can't quite point, to the evidence just yet. My guess is in 10 years we will. But I am very concerned that it's the nature of the discourse that is the problem, rather than any sort of particular technical issue.
Thank you so much. Again, sort of, I think, good reminders. First, of the fact that the impacts of trade are heterogeneous. And I think that, just the discussion we had on Mexico, Brazil, and African countries, even though we saw some similarities, did show that that's very much the case. But I think also for reminding us that despite that heterogeneity, we do know that for the most part, irrespective of where in the world we're looking at, the poor and the vulnerable are usually not able to protect themselves against the shocks that trade generates, and usually are not in a good position to take advantage of the opportunities that trade generates. And I think that sort of holds true no matter where we look. And what that means is that, I think even though we should continue to emphasize the gains that trade can bring, and I think this is a good moment to do that again, as you're pointing out, maybe that message needs to be a little bit nuanced, right? To acknowledge that those gains are not equally or uniformly distributed. And I think that's in part what this report sort of aims to do. But ultimately what that means, as you're pointing out, is that this is not a technical issue. There's a political economy of trade. And I think you were describing a little bit what the current status of that political economy is, and maybe we can come back to that in the next round of discussions. Let me close this first round of questions by maybe trying to bring things a little bit closer to home and turning to Marie to reflect on how are we at the World Bank thinking about trade and the gains that trade can bring, but also some of the risks that can be associated with it in the context of our approach to the recovery, right? You talked about this in your introductory remarks. The bank is talking about green, resilient, and inclusive development as a way to, to help the world recover from COVID. So what can we do? What are we doing within GREED, within this framework, to support developing countries in designing trade policy reforms that can boost growth, but also promote poverty and poverty reduction and shared prosperity? Over to you, Marie.
Yes, thank you, Carolina, and thank you to all the previous speakers who have given a lot of richness to our discussion. Let me just emphasize that what we're trying to do here at the bank, it's not new. We are trying to achieve a recovery and growth which is going to be simultaneously and systematically sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. And what does that mean? Is something within the context of trade policy reforms is what we're trying to do in this discussion. And I just wanted to start by saying that I agreed with Secretary Ferraz that trade policy is not the culprit for unequal gains, and it is also trade policy reforms at the same time are also not the panacea or the magic bullet for us to get out of this pandemic and ensure growth, poverty, and inclusiveness. I think as a former trade minister, I always said, unfortunately, trade policy is the easiest thing to turn on and off. Okay, we have problem in this sector, put protection on, raise the tariffs. It's the easiest thing to do, and politically, the politicians can say, yes, I've done something for you. So we're always struggling with this issue of trade policy in the absence of other policies. So I think that the first thing I would say is that what we're trying to do is to make sure that, as both all the three geographical representation here is emphasizing, we need a whole host of other complementary policies. And let me just put it in the three buckets that came out from this report, which is one was, how do you reduce distortions and improve the business environment? That is a very typical World Bank policy, trade policy reforms, reduce tariffs, and non-tariff barriers. There's a cross-border issue, behind the border issue, trade facilitation, and all that. But I do think, I just want to add the important dimensions of competitiveness and increasing productivity, which is going to be, this is the focus of why we want to remove distortions and improve business in the context of the recovery and sustainability agenda that is evolving as, as a challenge for developing countries. So developing countries coming out of this recovery, they have to think about diversification. It's either geographically or, because of their reliance on commodities or tourism, and finding new opportunities for export and competitiveness in the sustainability field. We have this carbon pricing and taxation becoming an issue. Europe by 2023 will be imposing cross-border taxation. So in the design of our trade policy reforms and competitiveness, we do have to think about sustainability issues, not just whether we can produce it the most efficiently and the most competitive, but competitive now includes sustainability within that measure. And in terms of identifying new opportunities for exports, I think, sir, we need to look very carefully at services besides manufacturing, going out of commodities. For those commodity exporters in coal, oil, and gas, that's the wake-up call on the transition and the climate change. That's going to be a big issue in the next 5-10 years that they also have to deal with. So diversification to what? To manufacturing, nature-based solutions, exports, and services, and digital and data-based exports. And that's a whole area of trade policy that needs to be part of the trade policy reforms. And I think we need to also pay attention to resilience. What does resilience mean? I'll just pick two very current issues that we are facing in the bank and trying to help countries with. One is the global value chains. With the pandemic, with the crisis, we have seen that global value chains have been disrupted. And so the consideration is not just efficiency, where you would source your suppliers and so on, but also resilience. You want to make sure that you can access many suppliers if one place shuts down. And this is, again, something that developing countries need to think about as to where am I in this global value chain? How do I show that I'm going to be a resilient and not just an efficient supplier? And the other big issue is, of course, vaccines and medical supplies. Where would be the manufacturing hubs? It's both a trade and investment issue. The patent waiver and the compulsory licensing is only one part of the issue. The technology transfer issue, the trade restrictions that need to be managed on the export and import side, and it's not just on the vaccines itself, but also on the raw material and supplies, right? So I do think this is in terms of the resilience agenda. Second, I think we want to make sure that it's growth, recovery, and sustainable, and also inclusive. And I think many of you here as policymakers, this is the big challenge. How do we, the report makes a lot about the concentration in geography and sectors, and it is about reducing the cost of trade. So I just want to echo Arturo's point earlier about, within the country, the regional disparities are huge. And this is really about how do you reduce costs of doing trade within the country, as well as you are integrating globally and regionally. And it is about infrastructure. It is about connectivity. It is about soft and hard infrastructure. I mean, myself as a trade minister, I had a huge task, big countries like Mexico, like Brazil, like Indonesia. How do you have domestic connectivity? You are talking about global connectivity and regional connectivity, but you also have to address domestic connectivity. And I just want to tell you a story about my experience with the World Bank. In 2009, there was a report, WDR report on geography, economics and geography. And that kind of turned the switch in our policy reforms, that we had to address the logistics issue domestically. And we even had studies where, you had a truck going from one end of Indonesia to another, just to see how many how many stops they had to make to understand what were the impediments domestically. So that's the kind of thing that we need to also do. And of course, inclusiveness means the human capital side, skills upgrading and so on. And how do you get SMEs involved, informal sector? And finally, factor mobility. I think this report and many previous reports also show that the lack of spread or the length of time when the benefits can be spread has a lot to do with labor mobility and capital mobility. So the rigidities in the labor policy is also a big issue if we want to have inclusiveness. So I think I'll stop there. I've tried to just describe to our audience what we're trying to do and kind of the bigger picture. Or maybe just one last point, because it was raised with the Africa on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. How do you deal with in negotiations? We're just talking about country level. How do you deal with benefits of trade when you're talking across countries? Let me just share with you that myself, as a previous trade negotiator, the framing has to be, yes, it's liberalization, it's facilitation, but it's also the third leg is what we call capacity building. So the more developed countries versus the more lesser developing countries. It's also about, when do you open up? You have a longer time frame, but also the request. Okay, if I'm going to be competitive to export to you, you need to give me capacity building in this sector or in this kind of area to be able to be competitive. So that's I think another area of how to make sure gains for trade is across countries being shared more equally.
Thank you, Marie, so much. And in a way, you brought sort of the conversation full circle by emphasizing the potential of trade to be a force in the recovery, which is something that Arturo sort of pointed out in his intervention earlier, but also reminding us that for that to happen, other things need to be in place. You talked about resilience. I think that's critical, but also about the need for domestic integration for countries to be successful in their international integration, which I think other speakers talked to. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to maybe in that time come back to a couple of the questions that we got in the chat, but I'm going to ask you to be very, very brief so that we can cover a couple of those. So I'm going to go first to Minister Herrera and Secretary Ferraz, and very briefly ask you to comment on the following. Abdiaziz Amin pointed out that in many developing countries, the informal sector and SMEs account for a large share of employment. And really ask, should we be thinking differently about the impacts of trade in this sector? And what are some of the policies that can maximize the positive impact of trade on on the informal sector, on SMEs? So very briefly, I'm gonna go to Minister Herrera first and then Secretary Ferraz.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, that's really at the core of what's happening when you compare labor situations between countries. Let me just give you, share a couple of numbers. In Mexico, between 56 and 57% of all the population in the labor sector works in the informal sector. So basically, the vast majority works on the informal sector. As opposed to, let's say, for example, an advanced economy, we don't have unemployment insurance. The minimum wage, I was calculating just before this, is 123 pesos, which is close to $6 per day, as opposed to $7.25 per hour in the US, right? So basically, you have a dual economy in the labor sector, and there are several things that has to be done. Some of them are in the in labor laws and labor regulations, but the other ones are in like the ones that I mentioned, training, human skills, and infrastructure. It's not sufficient to have the regulation; you have to create the opportunities. And a big issue in Mexico is the ability to finance firms properly. We have a relatively shallow financial sector compared, let's say, to Brazil, Argentina, Peru, and Colombia. Stop there.
Thank you. Secretary Ferraz, over to you very briefly in a minute, if you can.
So very, very briefly, I think the better, the business environment in a country, the higher, the participation of SMEs in international trade. We have a very low participation, by the way, here in Brazil compared to other countries. I mean, also the better the quality of our institutions, the better, of course, the quality of government intervention in the private sector, in the domestic economy. It also helps, the participation of SMEs. But most importantly, I think we need, when we talk about SMEs exporting to the world, we need to talk about the fixed and variable costs that those SMEs face, that are very high. So I would like to highlight the importance of trade facilitation. And in this regard, we have been doing a very important job here in Brazil with the implementation of the single window program that will reduce, time delays in Brazilian ports a lot. And of course, it will reduce as a consequence, the fixed and variable costs for the SMEs. And also, so just to conclude my intervention, we must also highlight the costs of TBT and SPS measures, which is also a very important barriers to the exports, especially in the case of small and medium enterprises.
Thank you very much. With a couple minutes left, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here. I won't attempt to summarize what I think has been an excellent and very rich discussion, which has really touched upon, I feel, almost all of the points and issues that the report deals with. So I hope that this really is an excuse, if one more was needed, for all of you that are connected to go and read the report and learn more about it. I want to thank our panelists for reminding us about the value of trade as an engine for growth and income growth, but also for agreeing, I think, with the main message of the report, that is that we shouldn't take for granted that those gains will be evenly distributed, and therefore there's a very important role for domestic policy to play in ensuring that indeed trade has positive distributional impacts. And with that, I'd like to thank again our panelists. I wish we had had more time to go over this issue, and of course all of you that were here with us and that contributed with your questions and just with your listening to this event. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you everybody. Thank you, Secretary Herrera.
Thank you,
Minister.